Keir Starmer has officially checked out of 10 Downing Street. He stood outside that famous black door, gave his tearful goodbye, and left the country looking for its 7th Prime Minister in a single decade. But while Westminster is obsessing over the political drama and who's going to win the crown next, you and I are staring at something much more stressful: the weekly shop. Because the brutal reality is that Tesco prices are now a massive problem for Britain's next Prime Minister. If the incoming leader thinks they can coast through their first 100 days on smooth political speeches and policy resets, they are in for a shock. The real battle for Britain isn't happening in the House of Commons, it's happening in aisle 4 of your local Tesco Extra. And that matters because Tesco isn't just any supermarket. With over 28% of the UK grocery market, it is the single clearest barometer of what food actually costs in Britain. When Tesco's prices shift, they shift for more households than anywhere else. Which is why every time a voter taps their debit card and watches their bank balance drop off a cliff just for buying the basics, a clock ticks down on the next government's survival. But here is the real kicker: the massive riddle running through the heart of the UK economy right now. Overall inflation has supposedly cooled down significantly. The official figures say things are steadying. So, if the worst of the crisis is supposedly over, why on earth does filling up a single blue Tesco crate still feel like you're paying off a second mortgage? The answer to that question reveals a terrifying economic trap, one that might just break the next Prime Minister before they even get a chance to unpack their bags. To understand why the next Prime Minister is walking into an absolute minefield, we need to expose the biggest myth floating around British politics today: the idea that falling inflation means falling prices. It doesn't. When you hear on the news that food inflation has slowed to around 2.2%, it doesn't mean your grocery bill is dropping. It just means the prices are going up slightly slower than they were during the absolute madness of the peak crisis. And that number is already dangerously misleading because the Food and Drink Federation is now warning it could rocket back toward 9% by the end of 2026 due to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. According to official data from the Office for National Statistics and the Food Foundation, the total cost of food in the UK has already skyrocketed by over 30% since April 2022. Let that sit with you for a minute. Here is mind-blowing fact number 1. It previously took over 13 full years, from 2008 to 2021, for UK food prices to rise by 30%. The cost of living crisis compressed that same increase into just 3 years, and the trajectory is now pointing sharply upward again. If the next British leader doesn't grasp how devastating this is, they are completely toast. For years, families have been playing supermarket Tetris, swapping branded items for Tesco's own brand range, switching to Clubcard only deals, or skipping meals entirely. If the incoming Prime Minister doesn't find a way to drive down structural food costs, millions of households face genuine, persistent food insecurity, and the new government will face the same verdict the last one did. But this brings us to an even deeper mystery. Tesco is a British institution, an absolute titan that controls over 28% of the UK grocery market. Surely a company that massive has the muscle to force suppliers to lower their prices and pass the savings on to us? Well, Tesco's own internal figures reveal a hidden structural shift that changes everything. Move past the flashing yellow Clubcard signs and you'll find that Britain's biggest supermarket is fighting its own quiet and exhausting war behind the scenes. Just days before Starmer threw in the towel, Tesco released its Q1 trading statement for 2026. The numbers were an absolute eye-opener. Tesco's UK sales growth slumped to just 1.8%, down from 3.1% in the previous quarter and a full 5.1% the same time last year. Think about that for a second. Even with most of us trapped into using Clubcards just to get a normal price on a jar of instant coffee, Tesco's growth is slowing down rapidly. And that leads us directly to our second mind-blowing fact. Despite ordinary families struggling to afford basic household items, Tesco's chief executive Ken Murphy saw his total pay package rise to a staggering £10.8 million as the supermarket expanded its market share. That is a £10.8 million payday at a time when 6.3 million adults across Britain were food insecure. When that juxtaposition lands on the front pages, it is not just a PR headache for Tesco, it is a political crisis for whoever is sitting in number 10. The incoming Prime Minister will face immediate public pressure to answer why the boss of Britain's biggest food retailer earns more in a year than most households will see in a lifetime, while queues outside food banks get longer. Now, it's incredibly easy to point the finger and say the supermarket is just greedy and profiteering, but that introduces a massive puzzle. If Tesco is allegedly raking it in, why on earth did their sales growth just completely collapse? To answer that, we have to look past the UK's borders and examine a global crisis that is actively hitting our dinner tables right now. The big secret that retail bosses don't want to discuss on camera is that British supermarkets are effectively at the mercy of global chaos. When Ken Murphy dropped those muted sales figures, he pointed directly to the conflict in the Middle East as a source of continuing uncertainty for customers. The Food and Drink Federation backed that up with an emergency warning, revealing that cost pressures have radically shifted from local energy bills to brutal international blockages and new trade barriers. The raw data behind this shift is genuinely frightening, and it leads us to mind-blowing fact number 3. The UK is exceptionally vulnerable to global shocks because we import over 40% of all the food we consume. Every piece of fruit, veg or grain brought over the channel faces expensive post-Brexit border checks that have permanently driven up import prices. This is where the next Prime Minister's job gets incredibly complicated. The FDF originally forecast food inflation would ease to around 3% by the end of 2026. They have now completely ripped up that model. The FDF now warns inflation could hit 9% by December, and has issued a direct call on the incoming government to intervene with targeted support for food manufacturers. That demand is now sitting in the in-tray of whoever takes over from Starmer. But this global chaos exposes a massive hidden contradiction. We are constantly told by politicians that local British farmers are the ultimate safety net against these international price spikes. If we import less and buy more locally, surely that fixes the problem. Well, that brings us to the most alarming chapter of this crisis, because British food manufacturing is currently facing an unprecedented wave of bankruptcies. The reality of British food manufacturing right now is nothing short of a tragedy, and it's happening completely out of sight of the average shopper. While you see lovely pictures of green fields on Tesco's British pork or homegrown veg packaging, the actual human beings running those farms and factories are going completely bust. The combination of skyrocketing energy prices, sky-high fertiliser costs, and supermarkets aggressively squeezing their margins has pushed domestic food producers over the edge. The data from the Food and Drink Federation exposes the true scale of this collapse, and it is mind-blowing fact number 4. Business insolvency rates among UK food and drink manufacturers have risen at nearly triple the rate of the wider manufacturing industry as a whole since 2019. We are actively watching our own domestic food supply chain crumble. Producers are walking away from the industry because they lose money on every single pint of milk or head of lettuce they sell to major supermarkets. When Tesco's British label shrinks because fewer domestic producers can supply it, that is a policy failure with a political owner. If the next Prime Minister does not act immediately with emergency support and business rate cuts for food producers, Britain will become entirely dependent on expensive, unstable foreign imports. And that leads us directly to the ultimate trap they cannot escape. When the next Prime Minister walks through the doors of 10 Downing Street, they will inherit a mathematical paradox that is virtually impossible to solve. On one hand, the British public is completely broke, exhausted, and demanding immediate relief from the relentless supermarket squeeze. On the other hand, Tesco and the wider retail sector are warning that if the government forces them to absorb higher operating costs, those expenses will be passed directly down to the consumer at the checkout till. Every lever the next Prime Minister pulls has a cost, and Tesco's pricing data will be the daily public verdict on whether they're pulling the right ones. Let's close our economic loop with mind-blowing fact number 5. According to ONS household spending data, the average British family now spends over twice as much on food and groceries each week as they do on keeping the lights and heating on. Food has officially replaced energy as the single heaviest economic anchor dragging down British families. The absolute crisis of affordability is the exact reason Keir Starmer's approval ratings cratered to historic lows, ultimately triggering his downfall. The ultimate lesson for the next occupant of number 10 is simple. You can survive a foreign policy crisis, Westminster gossip, and a party political scandal, but you cannot survive the yellow Clubcard stickers. The clock is officially ticking. But I want to hear from you. Are your local Tesco prices making you lose faith in whoever takes over number 10 next? Or do you think a new Prime Minister can actually turn this around? Let us know in the comments. And before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown of what's actually driving the cost of living in the UK.